This is a short presentation for individuals in the process of completing the Pedagogical Merit Review form for use of animals in teaching and training. This presentation is meant to help you avoid common application form errors and to give some guidance and examples for writing successful learning outcomes and creating curricular alignment in your application. Keep in mind, this is not an ethics application, but rather a pedagogical merit review. The process is an objective exercise that evaluates if a proposed live animal activity is the best learning activity for the students to achieve your identified learning outcome. This process also evaluates alignment between your identified learning outcome, your proposed live animal use activity, and your assessment of the outcome. We'll explore what these mean as we go through the presentation. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer these three guiding questions. First, what are three common scenarios where my application will likely be denied, and how can I avoid them? 2, how do I ensure my application is constructively aligned for a live animal use activity? And 3, how do I write a learning outcome for a live animal use activity? The first common scenario where your application will likely be denied is if your live animal use activity doesn't align with your outcome and/or assessment, or your outcome doesn't require a live animal. The example below demonstrates an outcome that does not mention the use of a live animal, even though there is a live animal use activity being proposed for the learning activity. This application would likely be denied because the proposed activity doesn't align with the stated outcome. So how do you ensure alignment so that you can avoid this common scenario? In education, we use a principle called constructive alignment to ensure we have alignment between three key areas. The learning outcome, which is a statement of what students will be able to do at the end. Assessment, which is how students will demonstrate what they have learned. And the learning practice feedback piece, this required for the learners to learn and master and develop in that skill. In this case, that's the live animal use activity that students will participate in to allow for this learning to occur. And as a learner, it should be very clear to me what's expected and how it will be assessed based on that outcome. And then that learning practice feedback should be a bridge to practice and to learn so that I am successfully able to meet the outcome in that assessment. Let me demonstrate what constructive alignment looks like using a basic example that I'll continue to reference throughout this presentation, making a basic loaf of bread. You can see the learning outcome is that the learners will be able to make an edible loaf of white bread in 2 hours using a basic white bread recipe. If you look at the assignment piece, it aligns directly back to that outcome. As an assessment, the learner is going to now make that loaf of white bread in 2 hours and will present it to their peers for a peer feedback. And that learning practice feedback piece that allows learners to develop, practice, and receive feedback is related to making bread. They're going to practice making bread in class and will receive feedback on their progress so that they can develop that skill to be successful in that final assessment. And this is an example of how those three pieces can align with each other successfully. So if we go back to our original example and look at the identified outcome, the learning outcome asks learners to investigate the literature and create a summary of how to perform the procedure, and then learners were assessed by submitting an essay related to their findings. So in this case, a live animal use was not the best learning activity. It didn't align with that stated learning outcome or with the assessment method. And in this case, the learning outcome was removed from the application. The second common scenario where your application is likely to be denied is if you've selected a verb in your learning outcome that is unclear or requires more explanation. The example below demonstrates an outcome that uses a broad, generic verb. It's develop an appreciation. The difficulty with generic verbs like understand or appreciate is that they're difficult to assess without more description. In this case, it would be very difficult to know the learners had developed an appreciation for the normal canine structures. So how do you select the correct verb in your learning outcome so you can avoid this common scenario? A tool like Bloom's taxonomy will help you identify the level that you expect your learners to perform at and to select an action verb that describes your learning intentions. But how do you change your outcome if you've already used a generic verb? Let's go back to our bread example. If I have an outcome that's using a generic verb, like this one, by the end of this session, the learners will be able to understand the process of making a loaf of bread. I ask myself a simple question. Well, how will you know that the learners, and in this case, understand the process of making bread? And your answer to that question often points you to the verb that you want to be using. So in this case, I would know that my learners understood the process of making bread because they make a loaf of bread. So if I were to rewrite my learning outcome, it would be that by the end of this session, the learner will be able to make a loaf of white bread using a basic white bread recipe. So just asking yourself this simple question will help you clarify what active verb you want to be using. So we can do that same thing with our original example. We ask the same question. So in this case, how will you know that your learners have developed an appreciation for the normal canine structures, etc.? And in this case, the answer came back, well, they'd be able to describe and evaluate those structures, in this case, as they were doing an endoscopy. And so those are the verbs that we put into that learning outcome, and that was how we avoided that common scenario here. The last common scenario where your application will likely be denied is if your description of the context for the live animal use activity is unclear or requires more explanation. Look at this example below. This outcome was very broad and general, which makes it difficult to determine if it has pedagogical merit. Could this not have been done in a lab or as a simulation without a live animal? So context is essential for determining if live animal use is required. So how do you include context in your learning outcomes so you can avoid this common scenario? Successful learning outcome requires 3 different elements: a verb, we already talked about that action verb, content, which is the content in your course, and context. And context is additional language and description about circumstances and degree. So learners know how well they need to be able to do something. These might be statements or descriptions of accuracy, speed, quality, etc. And having context is essential for moving from novice to expert. So let's return to the bread example to demonstrate the importance of criteria. So if you look at this first outcome here, I only have a verb and my content. So make a loaf of bread. I have no context included here. And the problem with this is that if I were an instructor and I've asked my class to make a loaf of bread, I'm going to get back at the end a lot of different looking loaves of bread likely, and it's going to be difficult for me to assess and to really evaluate what a good loaf of bread looks like. As a learner, I'm going to have a lot of questions about this. What is a good loaf of bread? How am I being assessed? What is the criteria? What are you expecting of me? And so without having context, there's just a lot of confusion that's created. So let's say we were to write this outcome for a novice learner, a beginner bread maker. What could that outcome look like if I add in some context? So I've written this outcome. It's make an edible loaf of white bread using a basic white bread recipe. And you can see I've added the context in red. I've added some criteria. We have edible, white bread, basic white bread recipe. So that's my novice, beginner level bread maker. And then I can change the context as we move up into more advanced levels. So maybe it's make a quality loaf of sourdough bread using a starter. Or as we go up into expert, make a quality loaf of artisan bread using a recipe that you've developed. So you can see how adjusting the context really provides direction in terms of what's expected and sets some parameters in terms of criteria. So as an instructor, I'm able to easily evaluate what good looks like, and students are able to identify what's expected of them at the end of that course or that session. So let's return to that original example again. And so we can now look at that first outcome, and I've color coded. You can see that we really actually only had a verb there and the content. And so there was no context. We couldn't tell if a live animal was required. We didn't know what level these learners were at. But as it turned out, they were actually specializing in this skill. And so we added some context in to help set some parameters and give some criteria to this learning outcome. So you can see here at the end, the learners will be able to demonstrate appropriate operation of the endoscope on an anesthetized intubated live dog within a 20 to 30 minute time frame while optimizing, etc. You can just see that adding that criteria, that context in, as a learner, I'd be able to read that outcome and know exactly what was expected of me. And as an instructor, I would have clearly defined criteria to assess my students and provide constructive feedback. So those are the 3 common errors that we see. You can see that many are related to writing good learning outcomes. And so here's just a few considerations for you as you're reviewing your outcomes before submission. Again, are they specific and clear? Are you using that active verb? Have you specified somewhere that the essential use of animals? Are they measurable? Do you have a context? Have you talked about the different criteria related to that outcome and that content? Are they attainable and realistic? Does it reflect the learning level and needs of your learners? And finally, are they relevant and essential to your course? Is this animal use activity considered essential by other experts? Will it be helpful in later courses or for employment in that field? So finally, in summary, we've gone through these three areas. So what are common mistakes made on applications and how can I avoid them? We talked about being able to avoid them by ensuring constructive alignment and that you actually reference a live animal in your outcome. Make sure you select an active verb in your learning outcome, and then describe the context for that live animal use activity. Create some criteria there. How do I ensure my application is constructively aligned? Keep looking through that lens of constructive alignment. Make sure that outcome, live animal use activity, and assessment all make sense, that they all align and they have some commonality between them. And finally, how do I write learning outcomes for a live animal use activity? And that's just going back to that formula, making sure you have that verb, the content, and the context all in there. If you want any additional support or want someone to review your application prior to submission, please contact myself or email the Gwen Amos Center, and our emails are just listed below there.